She stepped into the first-class cabin with grace and elegance, but the color of her skin instantly made her a target of disdain. A flight attendant approached, her voice cold and dismissive. "This seat isn't for you." The humiliation didn't stop there. It escalated to the point where security was called, waiting at the gate, ready to drag her off like a criminal. But they made a grave mistake. That woman was not someone who would back down. What happened next left everyone speechless. Watch until the end to uncover the shocking truth, and don't forget to leave a comment. What do you think about the flight attendant's behavior? The airport was bustling during peak hours, with crowds of travelers rushing past each other, dragging heavy suitcases behind them. The sound of announcements echoed through the terminals, guiding passengers to their boarding gates. Amidst the organized chaos, a woman walked with poise and confidence. Kiana Davis, a successful businesswoman and CEO of a leading real estate corporation, appeared with a commanding elegance. She wore a crisp white suit that hugged her tall figure perfectly, her Louboutin heels clicking rhythmically on the polished tile floor. A luxurious Hermes bag hung effortlessly on her arm, catching the light from the bright ceiling fixtures above. There was no need for her to rush. She was right on time, as always. In her hand was a first-class boarding pass, something she was more than familiar with. She moved through the security checkpoint with ease, her voluminous curls bouncing gently as she glanced at her watch. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. When she arrived at the boarding gate, she handed her ticket to a young staff member. He smiled warmly, scanned her pass, and nodded politely. "Have a wonderful flight." Kiana returned the gesture with a composed nod, her gaze calm but commanding. She stepped through the boarding bridge, her movements graceful but deliberate, every stride radiating assurance. The first-class cabin welcomed her with spacious seating and understated luxury. The subtle scent of premium leather lingered in the air, blending with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafting from the galley. Flight attendants stood by the entrance, greeting passengers with practiced smiles. Some travelers had already settled into their seats, while others were still getting situated. Kiana made her way to seat 2A by the window. She carefully placed her Hermes bag on the seat, then lifted her carry-on into the overhead compartment with precision. Everything was seamless, just the way she liked it. A sense of calm settled over her. This was what she had been looking forward to: a quiet flight, a break from the endless calls and back-to-back meetings. She retrieved a book from her bag, gently flipping open the cover, ready to lose herself in its pages. But the peace didn't last long. A sharp voice pierced the air beside her. "Excuse me, ma'am." Kiana lifted her gaze and met the cold, assessing eyes of a flight attendant. Her uniform was immaculate, the name tag gleaming under the cabin lights. But what stood out most was her expression. There was no warmth, no professional courtesy. Instead, there was scrutiny, suspicion. Maintaining her composure, Kiana tilted her head slightly. "Is there a problem?" "We need to verify your boarding pass," the attendant said, her tone more of a demand than a request. A flicker of irritation crossed Kiana's mind. This was not the first time she had flown first class, and it certainly wasn't the first time she had faced this kind of subtle challenge because of her skin color. But she chose not to jump to conclusions. Instead, she quietly slipped her boarding pass from her blazer pocket and handed it over. The flight attendant took the ticket, her eyes scanning the details, her brow briefly furrowing. She lingered in silence for a few moments before handing it back abruptly. Yet she didn't leave. She stood there, hesitating, as though weighing her next move. "This seat doesn't seem right. Are you certain this is your assigned seat?" Her voice carried an undercurrent of doubt. Kiana slowly placed her book on the tray table, her gaze steady as she met the woman's eyes. "My ticket says 2A. You just checked it. Is there an issue?" The attendant's face remained stoic, but her posture stiffened. "I need to confirm it with the system. Please wait here." She turned and walked away, leaving Kiana in her seat, calm on the surface, but all too aware of what might be unfolding beneath it. She turned and walked away, leaving Kiana alone with the curious gazes of a few passengers nearby. An uneasy feeling crept over her. No one else had been subjected to this kind of scrutiny. Only her. Pressing her lips together, Kiana leaned back into her seat, but inside she was already preparing for whatever might come next. A few minutes later, the flight attendant returned, her demeanor even more rigid than before. I've checked with the system, and it appears there's been a mistake. You'll need to move to economy class, she said, her tone flat and authoritative. The atmosphere in the first class cabin shifted, tense, heavy. Passengers subtly turned their heads, ears perking up to catch every word. But Kiana remained unfazed. She sat up straight, her eyes locking firmly with the attendant's. There's no mistake. My ticket is valid, Kiana said, her voice calm but resolute. You've checked it twice. I'm not leaving this seat. The attendant, Rose Harper, as her name tag read, gripped the hem of her uniform tightly, irritation flashing in her eyes. Ma'am, this is not a request. This is an instruction. If you refuse to comply, I'll have to call security, Rose snapped, her voice sharpening. A slow burn of anger ignited within Kiana. She had experienced this before, too many times, but each time it cut just as deeply. The suspicion, the doubt, the presumption that a black woman in first class must somehow be out of place. Kiana crossed her arms over her chest, her gaze steady and unblinking. Do what you have to do, she said, her tone cool and unwavering. Rose hesitated for a moment, seemingly caught off guard by Kiana's defiance. But instead of backing down, she turned sharply on her heel and strode toward the front of the cabin, likely in search of someone with more authority. A heavy, awkward silence settled over the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, whispers bubbling among them. Across the aisle, a young woman, Sophia Lee, leaned slightly forward, her fingers brushing against her phone. A faint glow illuminated her screen as she discreetly hit record. No one knew what was about to happen, but one thing was certain: this was far from over. The air in the first class cabin felt thick, like a dense fog. Curious and disapproving eyes drifted toward Kiana Davis. She remained still, her hands gently clasped on her lap, her posture calm and composed, but her gaze was sharp, cutting like a blade. Years in the business world had taught her one thing: sometimes composure was the most powerful weapon. A few minutes later, Rose Harper returned, but this time she was not alone. Trailing behind her was Michael Brown, the flight supervisor, a man in his 50s with a sturdy build and a kind face, though his eyes carried the sternness of someone accustomed to handling tense situations. He held a small tablet in his hand, scanning the cabin briefly before stopping in front of Kiana. Good afternoon, Michael greeted, his tone steady and professional. I'm the flight supervisor. I understand there's been some confusion about your seat. May I see your boarding pass, please? Kiana nodded, reaching into her blazer pocket. She retrieved the ticket and handed it over smoothly. In that moment, she felt the searing glare of Rose Harper fixed upon her. She understood. To people like Rose, Kiana's presence in this cabin was an affront. A black woman, draped in elegance, sitting among the wealthy, predominantly white passengers. It was an image Rose did not want to accept. Michael carefully examined the ticket, cross-checking it with the information on his tablet. His brows furrowed briefly, but then he gave a small nod. Everything checks out perfectly, he stated firmly. Miss Davis is in the correct seat. There's no mistake. A faint smile curled at the corner of Kiana's lips. She wasn't surprised. Her ticket had been valid from the start. Rose, on the other hand, stiffened. Her eyes widened in frustration and her lips pressed into a thin line as though she wanted to argue. But the tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers were watching. With visible reluctance, she muttered through clenched teeth, "Understood." "Thank you for your cooperation," Michael said politely, nodding to Kiana before turning to leave. But Kiana knew it wasn't over, and she was right. As soon as Michael disappeared from sight, Rose took a step back. But before turning away, she leaned in slightly and, whether out of spite or sheer pettiness, deliberately bumped her service cart against Kiana's seat. The jolt made Kiana's water glass wobble precariously, nearly spilling onto her open book. "Oh, sorry," Rose said, her voice devoid of any genuine apology. Her cold eyes, however, betrayed her true intentions. Kiana inhaled slowly, suppressing the surge of irritation rising within her. She knew exactly what Rose was doing, wielding what little power she had in an attempt to rattle her. But what Rose failed to understand was that real power lay in patience and precision. Across the aisle, Sophia Lee continued to hold her phone discreetly. She had started recording the moment Michael arrived. Now, having witnessed Rose's childish act of hostility, she zoomed in slightly, her expression keen, like a reporter capturing evidence of a scandal. A man sitting behind Kiana shook his head lightly and whispered to his wife, "She hasn't done anything wrong. Why are they targeting her?" The murmurs, the exchanged glances, they were like tiny needles piercing through the thin facade of professionalism that Rose was desperately clinging to. But instead of backing off, Rose seemed to spiral further into her bitterness. Her pride wounded, her anger festered into something more dangerous, a reckless need to exert control. Kiana could see it clearly. She had encountered this pattern too many times before. They didn't despise her for what she did. They despised her for who she was, a black woman sitting in a seat they believed she was never meant to occupy. As the other passengers began settling into their seats, Rose reappeared. This time, she stood tall in front of Kiana, her tone rigid, almost like she was issuing an order. "Ma'am, I need to remind you that this is the first-class cabin, and we expect all passengers to cooperate to ensure a smooth flight." Kiana lifted her gaze, locking eyes with Rose. "What exactly are you implying?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with steel. "I'm simply making it clear that any behavior disrupting the flight crew will not be tolerated," Rose replied, her eyes narrowing in challenge. A heavy silence settled over the cabin. Those nearby had heard every word. An older woman turned to her husband, whispering, "This is too much." Kiana remained in place, her voice cool but cutting. "You're harassing me, aren't you?" Rose arched a brow, seemingly caught off guard by Kiana's direct confrontation. But before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Excuse me, but I've been recording everything from the beginning. I haven't seen her do anything wrong. If anything, you seem to be the one causing the disturbance." Every eye turned toward the speaker, Sophia Lee. She placed her phone down on her lap, but her finger remained firmly on the record button. The color drained from Rose's face. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but after a brief pause, she took a deep breath, muttered something under her breath, and spun around, walking away. The air in the cabin seemed to ease, slightly, but Kiana knew better. This was merely a pause before the real storm, and she was right. Less than 10 minutes later, Rose slipped behind the galley curtain. Thinking she was hidden from view, she pulled out her phone. Her voice was low but sharp as she made the call. "We have a disruptive passenger in first class. We may need security assistance upon landing." Kiana's fingers tightened around the cover of her book. She had heard it all, and she knew. She had to be ready for the worst. But what Rose didn't understand was that fear had never been a part of Kiana's vocabulary. She had fought her entire life to claim her place in that seat, and if necessary, she would fight again until the end. The plane had been in the air for nearly an hour, but the tension in the first-class cabin remained thick, stretched tight like a wire, ready to snap. The other passengers could feel it. They didn't say anything, but their eyes would occasionally flick toward Kiana Davis, as though they were waiting for the next act in this uncomfortable drama they were witnessing for free. Kiana appeared to be focused on the book resting on her lap, but in reality, her mind was on high alert. Every nerve was tuned to the slightest movement from Rose Harper, the flight attendant who had made it abundantly clear she was determined to see Kiana out of that seat. Kiana had heard Rose's discreet phone call to the ground crew. She hadn't caught every word, but the body language, the brief, smug glance Rose shot in her direction afterward, it was all she needed. She knew exactly what was happening. She'd been labeled disruptive passenger. That meant security could be waiting for her when they landed. If they took Rose's version of the story at face value, Kiana could be escorted off the plane like a criminal. Just picturing it. Being a successful black businesswoman, led away in handcuffs under the scrutinizing eyes of strangers, smartphones raised to record every second, feeding the insatiable appetite of social media, tightened a knot in her chest. She had seen it before. She had worked twice as hard her entire life just to be taken seriously. And yet, one lie, one false narrative could unravel everything in an instant. No, she wouldn't let that happen. Sophia Lee, the Asian woman sitting 2 rows ahead, was still watching quietly. Kiana had noticed her subtle support earlier. Now, their eyes met for a brief second. When Rose turned her back, Sophia leaned slightly toward Kiana and whispered under her breath, "I've been recording everything. If anything happens, I'll back you up." Kiana froze for a heartbeat, then offered a small, grateful smile. For the first time during the flight, a hint of warmth pierced through the oppressive tension. But she knew videos weren't always enough. This world had a cruel way of twisting facts, especially when race was involved. Evidence could be dismissed, perception was often stronger than truth. Rose returned once again, but her aggression had been replaced with an artificial pleasantness. Kiana recognized the tactic. It was a mask, thinly veiling the resentment that still burned beneath. Rose moved through the cabin, distributing drinks to the other passengers. Her lips curved into a professional smile while her eyes remained cold, calculating. When she reached Kiana's seat, her hand was a little too forceful as she set down the glass of water. Liquid sloshed to the rim, threatening to spill. "Would you like anything else?" Rose asked, her tone polite but dripping with condescension, dragging out the word you just enough to make her contempt clear. Kiana's eyes didn't leave Rose's face. "No, thank you," she replied curtly, her voice steady. Their gazes locked for a long, tense second. An unspoken battle. Rose turned away, but Kiana knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Kiana's composure seemed to irritate Rose even more. The flight attendant lingered for a few more seconds, almost as if she were waiting, hoping for Kiana to snap, to give her the outburst she needed to justify her actions. But when that didn't happen, when Kiana refused to break, Rose had no choice but to walk away, her frustration barely concealed. A few rows ahead, an older man shook his head quietly. He had seen everything, the microaggressions, the thinly veiled hostility. He recognized injustice when he saw it, but like so many others, he chose silence. That, too, was something Kiana knew all too well. People witnessed, but they rarely intervened. The overhead speaker crackled to life, announcing that the plane would begin its descent in 30 minutes. Kiana felt her pulse quicken. The moment of truth was approaching. She unlocked her phone, drafting a message to her legal advisor. Her thumb hovered over the send button. It would only take one tap the moment they landed. She also pulled up the contact information of a journalist friend, someone with a reputation for exposing abuses of power, especially cases involving racial discrimination. If anything happened, Kiana would not allow herself to become another silent victim. She would make sure the world knew exactly what Rose Harper had done. Time dragged. Each minute stretched painfully slow. Through the window, the earth below grew clearer, the grid of roads, the rooftops of suburban homes, the faint shimmer of distant cars. Up front, Rose stood by the galley, speaking quietly with another flight attendant, but her eyes flicked toward Kiana more than once. And each time, there was that same smug flicker, the look of someone convinced she had won. In Rose's mind, this was already over. In just a few minutes, the doors would open. Security would be waiting. Kiana would be escorted out, humiliated in front of strangers with their phones ready, eager to capture the spectacle. And Rose would stand victorious, secure in her belief that she had put this troublesome black woman in her place. But Kiana pressed her lips together, her eyes sharp with resolve. She wasn't afraid. If Rose thought she would crumble, she was sorely mistaken. A familiar ding sounded overhead. The seatbelt sign illuminated. Final descent. Kiana tightened her grip on the armrest and took a steady breath. The storm was coming, and she was ready. The plane's wheels touched down with a gentle jolt, followed by the familiar screech of the brakes engaging. The tension in the first-class cabin pressed down like a weight. A few passengers let out quiet sighs of relief after the long flight, but Kiana Davis remained perfectly still. She felt her heart pounding in her chest, but her face stayed composed, calm in a way that was almost intimidating. It was the calm of someone who knew she was about to walk into a battle. The seatbelt sign clicked off. Passengers stirred, reaching up to retrieve their bags from the overhead compartments. But Kiana didn't move. Her hand tightened around her phone. Her pre-written message was ready, just waiting for a signal. The moment her phone connected, she would hit send. Her lawyer and her journalist friend, both prominent voices in the black community, would be alerted. If anything went wrong, the world would know within minutes. Up front, Rose Harper stood tall, her eyes sweeping the cabin like a queen surveying her kingdom. When her gaze landed on Kiana, the corners of her lips twitched into a faint smirk. Kiana recognized that look. It was the look of someone who believed they had successfully humiliated their target. Michael Brown, the flight supervisor, stood nearby, observing the scene quietly. His years of experience had given him a sixth sense for tension like this. He hadn't acted yet, but Kiana could tell. He was watching closely. He knew something was wrong. The cabin door creaked open. Humid air from the jet bridge drifted inside. But along with it came two uniformed airport security officers. Their expressions were firm, professional. Their eyes scanned the cabin until one of them stopped in front of Rose. She gave him a subtle nod before pointing right at Kiana. "That's the passenger I reported," Rose said, her voice honeyed with false sweetness, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of satisfaction. "She's been uncooperative and disruptive throughout the flight." Each word felt like a blade slicing into Kiana's dignity. But she didn't flinch. As the security officer prepared to step forward, Michael Brown raised his hand, blocking his path. "Hold on," Michael said firmly. "Hold on," Michael's voice rang out, clear and commanding. "I've been on this flight from the very beginning. From what I witnessed, Miss Kiana Davis has done nothing wrong. I strongly advise you to get all the facts straight before taking any action." The two security officers hesitated, exchanging a brief glance. The older one, who appeared to be the lead, furrowed his brow. "We received an urgent report from the cabin crew. This needs to be addressed." Michael didn't budge. "I'm more than willing to provide a formal statement, and if necessary, we can review the cabin's security footage. I'm confident you'll want to handle this by the book." The tension in the cabin was suffocating. All around, passengers had frozen in place, wide-eyed, listening intently. Some had already pulled out their phones, ready to record at a moment's notice. It was then that Kiana stood up, graceful, deliberate. She adjusted her blazer with care, her gaze sharp as it locked onto Rose. The disdain in her eyes was unmistakable. "I'm more than willing to cooperate with security," Kiana said, her voice cool and measured. "But before we go any further, you may want to see this." She turned toward Sophia Lee. The Asian woman, who had quietly documented everything, immediately lifted her phone. "I've been recording from the start," Sophia said firmly. "If you'd like, I can send this directly to Airport Legal." Her words struck like a hammer blow. Color drained from Rose Harper's face. Her eyes darted nervously, her lips parting as if to argue, but nothing came out. She pressed her mouth shut, her panic unmistakable. The lead security officer realized the situation had shifted. He nodded at Kiana, his tone professional but softer now. "Thank you, ma'am. We'll review all the information before making any decisions." Rose stepped back, her hands visibly trembling. The power she had wielded so carelessly mere moments ago was slipping away, replaced by dread. She was no longer in control. She was exposed. Michael seized the moment, his voice now firm and authoritative. "Ms. Rose Harper, I'm asking you to disembark the aircraft immediately. You are hereby suspended pending an internal investigation." A ripple of shock passed through the cabin. Murmurs spread. A man let out a low whistle, impressed. Kiana caught the slight tremor in Rose's shoulders. Her eyes, once filled with arrogance, were now wide with disbelief and fear. This was the consequence she had earned. Kiana straightened her back and stepped forward, walking down the aisle with the composure of a queen. Every stride declared what words could not. "I will not be broken." Women like Rose Harper may wield power in fleeting moments, but in the end, justice always finds its voice. Just before stepping off the plane, Kiana glanced back. Her eyes met Rose's one last time. She said nothing, but her gaze was louder than any words. "You lost." Rose's face was ghostly pale. She knew it too. Beyond the aircraft doors, the morning sun stretched across the runway. A new day was beginning. But for Kiana Davis, this was more than a sunrise. This was the day she reclaimed what was always hers, her dignity, her respect. And she knew this was only the beginning. She would go further than they ever imagined. Kiana Davis stepped off the plane, her Louboutin heels clicking sharply against the metal bridge. The crisp morning air brushed against her face, carrying faint traces of the overnight rain. But the chill outside was nothing compared to the storm of emotions still swirling within her after what had unfolded in first class just moments ago. Her phone buzzed in her hand. The signal was back. Without hesitation, her fingers flew over the screen. She hit send on the pre-written messages, first to her legal advisor, then to her journalist friend from a respected media outlet. Each message felt like loading a bullet into the chamber. ready to fire at anyone who dared tarnish her dignity. As she stepped into the VIP lounge, Kiana spotted Emily Carter, the airline's crisis management representative, waiting near the entrance. A woman in her early 40s, Emily had sleek blonde hair and wore a tailored gray suit. Her smile was professional, but the tension in her eyes betrayed her. She knew she was about to face a storm. "Miss Davis," Emily began softly, her voice measured, "I want to personally apologize for what happened on board. We are currently conducting a full review of the situation. I hope you'll allow us a few minutes to discuss this further." Kiana gave a slight nod, her eyes sharp but composed. She wasn't angry. She was focused. She had heard these apologies before. Words were cheap. What she needed was action. They were led into a private suite reserved for first-class passengers. The room was tastefully decorated, but the weight of the situation made it feel stifling. Waiting inside was Michael Brown. His posture was firm, his expression more serious than ever. When he saw Kiana enter, he offered a small nod, an unspoken message: "I'm on your side." Emily launched into a polished corporate apology, the kind crafted for damage control. But Kiana had no patience for scripted sympathy. "Miss Carter," Kiana interrupted, her voice cutting through the formalities. "Let's not pretend this was a simple misunderstanding. We both know it wasn't. This was blatant racial discrimination by one of your employees, and I can promise you I will not let this be swept under the rug like so many times before." Emily faltered for a moment. She knew exactly the kind of client Kiana was. Women like her didn't accept empty apologies and quietly move on. They had influence, they had power, and most importantly, they knew how to make their stories heard. "I understand. We are fully committed to conducting a thorough investigation and taking appropriate action," Emily said, her tone firmer this time. Kiana didn't respond right away. She held Emily's gaze, a silent declaration that she would be watching every step of the process. The conversation stretched on for a few more tense minutes before it concluded, the weight of unspoken consequences hanging in the air. As Kiana stepped out of the room, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her journalist friend. "I've got everything. Say the word, and this hits the front page tonight." A small smile curved Kiana's lips. That was the truth of power in this world. It didn't lie in uniforms or name tags. Real power was in information, in stories being brought into the light. Meanwhile, in a cramped room elsewhere in the airport, Rose Harper sat hunched in a chair. Across from her were two stern-faced members of the airline's disciplinary committee. Her face was pale, her eyes red and puffy from stress. Her employee badge had already been confiscated the moment she stepped off the plane. She was officially suspended, pending investigation. Everything had unraveled so fast. Barely an hour earlier, she had felt triumphant. Now, she was the one under scrutiny, her entire career hanging by a thread, all because of a few moments of arrogance and unchecked anger. "We've reviewed the video footage submitted by a passenger, and we have a full report from Flight Supervisor Michael Brown," one of the committee members read from a document. "It is clear that you engaged in discriminatory behavior, abused your authority, and intentionally created a hostile situation for passenger Kiana Davis." Cold sweat trickled down Rose's spine. The video, what she had brushed off as a few sneaky clips, had now become irrefutable evidence, boxing her into a corner. I I was just following protocol. I thought maybe there was a mistake. I didn't mean to." Rose's voice trembled, but she knew. She knew no one was buying it. Losing her job was now a real possibility. But what scared her more was the thought of becoming a headline. Stories about racial discrimination in the airline industry spread like wildfire. She had seen other flight attendants destroyed by the backlash, careers obliterated, reputations beyond repair. Some never recovered. Their lives were reduced to whispers of disgrace, and now it was her turn to face that abyss. Panic crashed over Rose like a wave, and she let out quiet, broken sobs. But this time, no one came to her rescue. No sympathetic glances, no respect in their eyes. All that remained was contempt, disgust. The meeting ended with a final, icy statement. "We will consider termination pending the outcome of the investigation." Rose nearly collapsed as she stood up, her legs trembling beneath her. But what haunted her most wasn't the committee's verdict. It was the look in Kiana's eyes as she stepped off that plane. That gaze, calm and victorious, without needing a single word. It was burned into Rose's mind, a reminder that on that day she hadn't just lost control, she had destroyed her own life. Kiana stepped out of the airport, drawing in a deep breath. The morning air felt lighter, cleaner. The battle today was over, but she knew greater fights lay ahead. Because for Black women like Kiana Davis, simply existing, holding on to success in this world, was a daily battle, and she was ready to fight every single day. Do you think the flight attendant deserved what happened? Or do you believe she deserves a second chance? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories where justice always finds its way. Um, Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.